We get a lot of questions at Hamilton Native Outpost about how do I seed my wildflower or grass seeds by hand? Can I even do it that way? Do I have to have a machine to do it? And no, you don't have to have a machine to do it. By hand is a really great technique, especially for small areas. And so today I'd like to go over some of the hows and the how not to's and give you some tips for how to seed by hand. One of the big tips for seeding by hand is to mix the seed with carrier. So you've got your area, you've mapped it out, you've measured the size of it, so you know how much seed you need at this point. You've got your seed in your hands and you're standing out there in the field and you're looking at this little pile of seed and you're looking at this big area and you're saying, how in the world am I going to get this spread evenly? And the answer to that is in the carrier. There's nothing magic about carrier other than it gives you more stuff to spread because it'll help make your spreading more even and help you to not run out before you get across the field. So, what can you use for carrier? Basically anything to bulk up the mix that is weed-free. And you don't want to be introducing weeds with your native plants, so that's a really important point. So some really good examples of a carrier would be kitty litter, dried distiller's grain, which is a byproduct of the ethanol industry that is often used as feed for livestock. Rice bran, rice hulls, you can use sawdust is another really good option. Cornmeal, it doesn't matter as long as it doesn't have weeds. Sand does not tend to be a good option because it often comes with weed seeds in it. I usually avoid the sand pretty heavily. If you're using a cover crop as a carrier, say oats or wheat or something like that, you don't want to provide too much competition for your young seedlings from that cover crop. Just make sure you've got a plan for how to deal with that and that you're not getting too much put out there. So take your seed and mix it with a carrier. How much seed, how much carrier? Well, you of course know how much seed you've got, but how much carrier do I put with that? It's going to depend on how comfortable you are with doing the seeding. If you're not very comfortable, if this is your first seeding you've ever done by hand, or you're just not very comfortable with it, not very practiced up, add more carrier. Err on the side of more. So for me, what I like to do is use equal volumes of carrier and seed. So if I have a coffee can of seed here, I'm going to use a coffee can of carrier. Now these are not necessarily equal in weight, but they're equal in volume. I find that to be a nice match. But if you're pretty concerned about it, put 1 coffee can of seed and 4 coffee cans of carrier. It just means there's more stuff for you to spread. Also, maybe you just want to practice spreading the carrier alone so that you can figure out how much stuff you'd like to spread. So if you go through and, spread some little section or something that you've got measured off and you're like, well, it took me a 5-gallon bucket and I felt pretty good about my spread rate, make sure you put a 5-gallon bucket of carrier. You want your ultimate mix to be a 5-gallon bucket's worth of, if it's that same area or if it's bigger, do your math to figure out how much you need for that bigger area. So err on the side of plenty is usually my advice for how much carrier to put in. But there's no magic here. It's kind of whatever you feel comfortable with. So I brought with me this handy little tub to mix the seed and carrier. There's multiple ways to do this, but one is to use a tub like this, and you can dump, so much. I could put 5 coffee cans of seed in and 5 coffee cans of carrier in, or however I'm going to measure this. But I can mix it in here, or maybe I can fit all of my seed and carrier in here. So as I'm mixing the seed and the carrier, of course I want to make sure I get all the way to the bottom. I also want to make sure that I'm getting my corners well. It's kind of like making a good pan of brownies. You want to make sure you don't have a flower pocket or something in your brownies. And so I'm trying to get a good solid mix here. Another way to do it is a concrete floor or some sort of, large concrete surface. You can take and dump your seed, dump your carrier. Make sure it's a day that's not too windy, I suppose, if it's outside. And then get a scoop shovel or a snow shovel or something of that nature and just mix it, with that shovel. That's another good solution. So there's no real magic to how to get your carrier and seed mixed other than either find a big enough container or a big enough space to get it out, dump it out, and get it thoroughly mixed together. Okay, so now we've got our carrier and our seed mixed together. and we think we've got a nice ratio. Maybe we want to do a practice run with just some carrier. We talked about that a little bit to get ourselves more comfortable with it. But now what I like to do is I like to take my seed carrier mix and divide it into 4. So maybe I get 4 buckets and just, we're not going for scientific accuracy here. We're going for roundabout, have it divided into 4 different piles or buckets or something like that. So it just depends on the size of the planting as to how much, space you need to put it into the 4 different piles or buckets. So we get it divided into 4 different piles or buckets, and the reason I do that is because I'm going to do the same thing to my area that I'm going to seed. I can just roughly step it off. I can measure out the area on my phone or on a computer and say, oh, well, if I go from here to that tree, that's about a quarter of the area or whatever. And so I like to divide my area into 4s. Once I get through the first quarter of my planting, if I'm long on seed, that's good. I respread that quarter. Just do it again. If I'm short on seed, I'm like, oh, I better calibrate myself down, either add more carrier or, spread less thickly as I'm going through my area the second time. So that is what I'm doing to just get myself calibrated, allow myself to learn on the first quarter so that I don't have to go get more seed in the end of the project. To step an area off to divide it into these 4s, you can just, let's say you've got a square. And so you just take consistent size steps. Mine tend to be about a yard, but different people have different size step. And it doesn't even really matter how big your steps are, right? Because you're just counting steps. Well, it's 50 steps by 70 steps. 3, 4, 5, 6. And it doesn't even really matter how big your steps are. Let's just say it's 100 steps by 200 steps. Well, if I'm going to divide it into quarters, I'm going to divide it at 50 steps, and then on that side I'm going to divide it it was 200, so I'm going to divide that. That would give me 100 steps. So each square is going to be 50 by 100. And so now I've got it equally divided into 4. So that's how you can use your steps as a measurement to kind of help you divide it into 4 pieces. Once you get it divided into 4 pieces, either by stepping it off or by doing that with a mapping app or whatever, some flags come in really handy. These are surveyor's flags, and they work really well to put in the ground, and you can see them from a long distance, so you can kind of know where you've made your delineations. You can put some along the mark if you want. Sometimes it's really quite adequate to maybe put one in the center of your, where all of them, the lines were meeting up. And sometimes it's just enough to put one on each of the cuts in the middle. You can mark it with these flags, or here's flagging, another really great tool that you can use to mark off, tie this onto a tree or some tall plant or a fence post or something like that. So you can use this as well. And of course, a consideration for seeding when you're doing a seeding is what time of year do you do it? And you can see I'm dressed up for the warmth today. If I was going to really get into this seeding and do a bunch of it, I'd probably be shedding my coat after a while. But it's pretty cold today, and so that's an ideal time for most native seedings. Most native seedings need to be done in the dormant season. There's a few exceptions with some of the warm season grasses where they can actually be done in the spring. But again, you can find more information about when to seed if you're unsure about that on our website. So now we're ready to start seeding. So how is it that you go about seeding it now that we've got it in a bucket, or we've got it however it is sitting in a pile on the concrete floor? How is it that we go about seeding it? There are the little hand seeding crank devices or whatever, but a lot of times those don't work well with seeding natives because a lot of the natives have a real fluffy seed. Think of feathers, and think of trying to get feathers to go out a hole in the bottom of your cedar, or sometimes the holes are even smaller. And so those feathers want to bridge up over that. So really what I find the most effective method to be is you take a bucket under one arm and you start flinging with the other. The technique of how do I go about actually put the bucket under one arm and start flinging with the other. It sounds really great until you're sitting here awkwardly with your bucket. How do you do this? So I like to just give my bucket a big hug, put it kind of under my arm, and there's nothing too fancy about it. Sometimes I'll hold it like this if my hands get tired, but really it's a whole lot easier to hold it under your arm. Holding it by the handle, it's awfully low, and you just can't get easy access to it. So this gives you the easiest access to the bucket for your hand that's doing the seeding. So I'm going to reach into my bucket, and I'm just going to start flinging the seed. And so there's a certain technique, and if you're not comfortable with it, practice with the carrier alone. It's a great way to get yourself comfortable before you're actually involving the seed. So as you practice your technique, you grab a handful of seed. You can only fit so much seed in your hand. There's no point in, getting so much that then you're losing it as it comes out of the bucket. No point in that. So you can only fit so much in your hand. And what you're going to do is you're going to gently kind of move your thumb as you do it. I don't know, it's just one of those things you're going to have to practice and get the feel for, but it's a matter of letting the seeds leak out in a controlled manner, leak out of your hand in a controlled manner, if that makes any sense. What is it that we're aiming for with our technique? What are the goals, right? We want even spread across the area that we're seeding. If we're going to seed this whole arc in front of us, we don't want all of the seed to come out right there and none be left for our seeding, motion by the time we get to the far side of us. So it's kind of doing it in this controlled manner so that we get even spread of it. As you go, you're watching and you're seeing you can kind of watch the spread of that seed a little bit. Not that you necessarily see where the seeds land, but you kind of get this sense of okay, the seeds are going out, 5 foot in front of me or 10 foot in front of me. Then okay, well, if I take another step, I can keep seeding. So for each step that I take, maybe a handful is lasting me 2 steps or something like that. I don't want to just wander all over this like a snake. I want to do this in a very methodical way. So I've figured out that when I'm seeding this, I have about a 10-foot spread right now with the seed that I'm using and the day that I have about a 10-foot spread. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of stand in the middle or maybe to one side or the other, depending on how I feel like my seed is spreading, of this 10-foot path. And I'm going to go 10 foot down. I'm going to turn around and I'm going to move over and come back in the next 10-foot swath. If I need to, I can mark out my swath with the flags. And then I can mark out another swath with a set of flags too. I'm going to put the flags here. So I'm going to start actually standing because the seed is flying out in front of me. When I'm slinging it with my hand, I'm actually going to start standing out of the planting. Here I go. Now I'm going to stop before the end of my planting. And the reason for that is the end of the planting, I'm slinging the seed out in front of me. As I turn around to come back, I'm looking at the 2 flags. I've got myself positioned between the 2 flags that are in front of me. And so I'm going to do my first swipe. Yep, that's doing about right as far as getting the coverage between those 2 flags. So here I go. And I'm paying attention that my seed is not, if one of my handfuls is only getting over here, of course I'm paying attention, and the next one I'm scattering more towards this side of my planting. But ideally, the swipes go all the way across is usually how I do it. A great time to do a seeding is actually when there's snow on the ground. Not that the snow is magic in any way, and there's actually some words of caution too about the snow, but the really good thing about the snow is you can see where you've been. You can kind of see where the seeds are going as well, and you can see your tracks, and so you can kind of track yourself a little bit easier. And that applies not only to if you're doing it by hand, but if you're doing it with a machine as well. You can see your tractor tracks out there to know where you've been. Now, the words of caution about seeding on the snow are that the snow needs to be you want it to be kind of one of those melting days where the snow is not really crispy. But when the seeds fall on there, they're dark colored, usually most of them. We want them to immediately start sinking so that they're not sitting up there on top of that snow just waiting for a bird to come by and get them. One thing I really love to do when I'm doing a planting is to cross hatch it. And so if I'm planning on seeding my planting this way, so I go down and I come back and I do that S, sharp S, or however you want to call it, zigzag pattern. It's not really a zigzag, but just down and back, down and back, down and back. If I do that across it, then I love to go the other way, like a checkerboard, and do it the other way. So then I've got this crosshatch pattern where if I was a little uneven in my spread on the first go round, the down and back, the back and forth, hopefully I got some seed on that area. Now, of course, you need to account for this when you're doing your planting, right? If you're going to basically double seed it or crosshatch it, you're going to have twice as seed carrier mix as you were going to have if you were only going to do it once. So plan that in if you plan on doing that. If you get through a seeding and you still have some seed in your bucket, that's fine. Either think about where you think the seed was spread least good, or just go seed it all again. Extra seed at the end is way less of a problem because you can always scatter it out there than having not enough seed at the end, because then you're in the conundrum of what do? I don't have anything planted on this particular area. Do I go get more seed and incur the expense and the trouble and the time of that? Or, what do I do? The options are not good then. So you'd really rather err on the side of having extra seed and carrier mix left over, because you just go spread it out there, go spread it again. That's just fine. Than you would running out before you get done. An important note when you're doing a seeding, and we've got a lot of other guides and videos on this sort of thing, is to make sure you have a good seed bed. A main overarching goal, and I'll just boil it down to this and then refer to those other guides, is when your seed falls out of your hand, it needs to land on bare mineral soil. So if it's on top of a leaf, if your seed falls out of your hand on top of this oak leaf, you don't have success. You need bare mineral soil. You want seed to soil contact. Now you don't need it buried in the soil necessarily, but you do need good contact with the soil. So check out some of those other guides if you want some more thoughts on, is my seed bed ready? Do I need to drag it? Do I need to, what technique can I use to do different things? Check out some of other guides on our website. I'm Elizabeth with Hamilton Native Outpost, and it's a real passion of ours for people to be successful with native plantings, because it doesn't do any good for us to raise the seed for you if your planting is not successful. So we love to provide you tips and tricks on how to do things, and we love to share our knowledge and our passion of native plants with you all.